So I've been practicing my superhero skills, and I've figured out how to start fire with my mind. If I concentrate on one spot on the paper, I can make it catch on fire. I'll show you. Here we go. See that? Oh yeah, check that out. Now that's what I call brain power. Obviously I don't have special mind powers to allow me to spontaneously ignite paper. Nobody does. I used a DC power supply with some wires, a switch, and a little bit of steel wire. I connected these ends to the DC power supply, then ran this up through my shirt. I put this tiny little switch inside my shirt on my left hand, and that ran to this tiny steel wire that got hot and made the paper catch on fire. The point is that you can use really simple things like this to make something that looks fantastic, even though it's not difficult to do, which is exactly the principle that I'm gonna use to turn myself into Endeavor, the superhero from a show called My Hero Academia. If you've seen the show, you know how good it is, and you know how many characters there are with really interesting powers, but most of them are insane. There's no way to replicate what some of these characters do in real life. And Endeavor is kind of mysterious, and he's got a power that I can replicate. I used a couple of these fuel solenoids on my fire tornado thing. And I got this on Amazon and this one. And in the descriptions, it says that the flow rate is the same between the two. But this one's 1/4 inch fed and this is 1/8 inch, and this one is way bigger. So this little guy is gonna make it much easier to hide the components to pull off the illusion of me creating fire out of my hands. But it doesn't matter how small and hideable the component is, if I can't actually utilize it to create a huge fire from seemingly nowhere, which is why we need to consider the science of flames and combustion. If you've ever watched anything burn, you know there's multiple colors within the flame, and counterintuitively, the red part is the coldest and the blue part is the hottest. I know it seems strange that a cold color like blue would have higher energy and heat than a hot color like red, but if you look at the visible light spectrum, which is actually just a gauge of electromagnetic radiation, which is why you can actually see fire in the first place. Blue is higher energy, red is lower energy. Blue is a faster wavelength, red has a slower wavelength. So now it kind of makes sense, because everything you see is electromagnetic radiation, but that gets into quantum mechanics, and that's too much information to discuss in this video. The lesson is blue flames are super hot, and red flames are still really hot, but not as hot as blue flames. The auto ignition temperature of propane is 470 degrees Celsius, which is lower than the visible part of the red flame. And if you've ever watched a candle or a match or a lighter or anything that makes a small flame burn, you know that the blue part is really tiny and the red to orange part is really big. So even though the blue part is hotter, you have a much bigger volume of heat with the rest of the flame. And stoichiometry refers to the ratio of fuel to oxygen, and if it's ideal, you get a very hot flame. But how thoroughly it's mixed determines the temperature of the flame and the efficiency of the burn. Practical example. Propane torches are designed to create a perfect stoichiometric ratio so that you get the most efficient burn possible to create the most heat. That's why it's blue, because it's really hot. But if you reduce the amount of atmosphere that's drawn into the flame, you change the stoichiometric ratio, and it changes from blue to yellow, orange, and red, because it's not burning as efficiently. And the flame gets a lot bigger. Nearly all combustion reactions occur in a gaseous state. So even when you watch wood burn, the flames that are coming off are actually gases released from the wood that's reacting with oxygen in the atmosphere. The wood itself is not actually on fire. Weird, right? But for what I'm trying to accomplish, I need a heat source over a large area to initiate combustion over a potentially very small stoichiometric range. Since the blue part of the flame is hotter than the orange part of the flame, it should catch the paper on fire faster. Right? The orange part worked better, even though it's not as hot. There was a higher volume of high temperature in the orange part than there was in the blue part. So obviously you don't need a blue flame to efficiently catch something on fire. And all I need to do is start a combustion reaction with propane, which sounds easy enough. To make sure this actually looks like a superpower, I'm gonna set up the same system on each hand that I had in the fire tornado thing. And that means that an excessive amount of liquid propane is gonna be coming out of the nozzles right at my hands, and it's not gonna have a whole lot of time to disperse to give me a stoichiometric ratio to actually catch it on fire. You can't just burn liquid propane, it has to be mixed evenly with oxygen. So my pilot flame generation is gonna have to extend far enough out that it catches the propane on fire, and then this whole thing will be a big giant flame. So I don't want a stoichiometric pilot flame because it won't burn far enough out to catch the rest of it on fire. But it shouldn't be too hard because the interface of the propane and the ambient air is going to have some level of mixture that'll allow the rest of it to catch on fire, and it'll just turn into a big giant flame thing. But propane stoichiometric ratio is 1 to 26.11, so that means you need a lot of air to the amount of fuel that you have. So when you're shooting liquid propane, it makes it a lot more difficult to reach that ratio. Another principle of combustion is that the higher the temperature, the less accurate the stoichiometric ratio has to be, which is why I'm going to use plasma. These are the perfect solution for high temperature ignition in a very small area. And you can get these things really cheap on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description to the ones that I got. The only modifications these are gonna need is extending the arc points out to the end of the nozzle and extending the wires for the button. It would be fantastic to run a separate tunable fuel source to make a perfect pilot light for this system, but that would take up a lot of extra space and it would make it a lot harder to hide it and make it look like I actually have the superpower of making fire. So since I don't have that luxury, I'm gonna port into one of the main fuel ejection nozzles after the solenoid with this little tiny aluminum tube and run that through this little tiny copper pipe to create a makeshift carburetor, just in reverse. Because typically carburetors use high-speed air to draw fuel in, this is going to use high-speed fuel to draw air in. And then the plasma lighter will ignite this, and then that'll burn just below the rest of the liquid propane that's shooting out, and it'll all catch on fire, hopefully. And now that we know the principles behind how all this should work, it's time to put it together and see if it actually does. There's nothing better than practical testing. To get a really high flow rate of liquid from these propane tank lines, I'm going to use the same technique that I used in the Fire Tornado build and in the Super Sledge build, where I drill this out and use a tiny piece of copper and solder it in place so that the valve is still depressed whenever you screw this on. If you can't figure out how to search for those videos on my channel, I'll put a link in the corner in the thing. Just got to turn that little hole into a big hole and still push the valve in, just like that. Teflon tape is absolutely necessary in this situation because it makes a solid seal and it keeps propane from leaking out and catching me on fire. The threads on these little solenoids are not cut very deep, so it's difficult to get these things started. So I'm using white, which is thin. But you're actually supposed to use the yellow kind, which is much thicker when you're sealing up gases instead of liquids. But if I put this on, it wouldn't actually, I wouldn't be able to thread this in. I need to use the thick stuff on this compression fitting because this thing is only meant to crimp down and create a tight seal for liquids, not for gases. But there's a cool trick to make this work for gas. First, you install it and you crush it nice and tight. Take it back off, and now that the ferrule is set in place, you wrap it, and that will almost definitely seal it. No propane squirting out catching me on fire. If this works, I'm gonna be ecstatic. This is just for the test. I'm definitely gonna make this a lot easier to use once it's all strapped onto my body. You know? Can you see that? Is that in frame? Got it finished and it's ready to go. Plasma arc system right there. I'm gonna shoot propane, battery pack that's running the solenoid, 12 volts, the wires for the lighter. So when I hit these two buttons, the arcs are gonna happen and the solenoid is gonna dump liquid propane from this upside down propane tank. Here we go. There it goes. That works, but I don't think the flow rate on this solenoid is as high as it says it is, because when I used this one, it shot a lot more propane out. I don't know what to do about that. Maybe I'll just use these. Anyway, see how the concentration of propane is putting out the fire because it's so far rich, you can't actually get combustion. That's why we talked about all that science. But if it gets hot enough, oh, well, that's probably part of the reason it's arcing to the copper instead of between the wires. Fix. Alright. So it's working, but not consistently. That's probably why the lighter had a ceramic holder for the wires, because plasma is super hot, you know, it's the fourth stage of matter. Solid, liquid, gas. Right? Plasma is 4, and it's... But this is not shooting. I mean, that's really big fire. But it's not as big as I thought it was going to be, or that I wanted it to be. So this is really small. It's going to be easy to hide, but that does not make a huge flame. I want 30-foot flames, not... Well, that's about 10... I'm getting like a 9-foot flame on this thing. Maybe I'm just gonna have to use these. It's gonna be really difficult to hide on my forearm. I don't even know how. So the system works, but it's not super consistent. With a little bit of tuning, I should be able to make this reliable. And the rest of this build is gonna make this project really good. That's it for this time. I'll see you next time if you watch my videos. Thanks for watching. Bye. It's a lot of little sciencey things to make this little tiny jobby. It is pretty cool. Let's see if I can shoot you. Shoot past you. When you do it inside, it's way more crazy.